Hello again, everybody. I'd like to begin the discussion tonight by introducing our guests, artist Sarah Lynch, landscape architect Alistair Kirkpatrick, and zooming in from Germany, we have the director of tonight's film, Matthew Gandy. Matthew, welcome. Hello. Matthew is a professor of cultural and historical geography at Cambridge University, an urbanist and a cultural critic. He's published widely on urban and environmental themes, including more recently in the book The Botanical City in 2020, and in his latest book, which is just out this year and like our film tonight, is entitled Natura Urbana. Unfortunately, we didn't quite manage to get the shipment in time, so we failed at the first kind of commercial hurdle there for tonight's event. But nevertheless, we do actually have a 10% discount available for you guys if you'd like to purchase either of those two books this evening, and hopefully we can get them across to you when that shipment lands sometime in the next few weeks. Sarah is an artist who works primarily across digital and analog photography, video and installation. Sarah's work explores themes of botanical diversity and the relationship between plants, people and the ecosystems they inhabit. More recently, she developed workshops for the Studio 15 Art Collective here at Collingwood Yards, including the fantastic spontaneous plants of Collingwood Derive for the Garden State Festival. We actually have the Derive map available here as well at the desk for free if you guys wanted to grab that. It's a great map of the local area and identifies a couple of key kind of spontaneous species that you can find in and around this neighbourhood. Alistair is the co-founder of ACAS, a landscape architect, university lecturer and writer. Over the past 20 years, he's worked across the disciplines of botany, garden design and ecology, with a focus on Melbourne's Indigenous vegetation. He's also a regular contributor to the magazine Landscape Australia, where he's written about the so-called war on weeds, novel ecologies, and how we might design more resilient urban landscapes. Matthew, I might actually start with you this evening with a question in two parts. How does an academic and geographer end up directing a film, and one about botany at that? What drew you to the subject and specifically this medium?
Well, thank you very much for having me, and I hope that you can hear me okay. I think the first comment to make is that I have a long-standing interest in cinema as a medium, both writing about cinematic representations, but also using film as a method. So, in fact, this is the second film that I've directed as part of my geographical research. The first one was in Mumbai in India, looking at urban infrastructure. So it seems to me to be a natural way of trying to communicate ideas to a broader audience and stepping outside of the academy. On the specific question about what drew me to botany and urban plants as a focus, urban nature has been a long-standing fascination of mine since I was a child, really, growing up in London. So it's always been there as a topic that's really interested me. And also working in Berlin over a long period, it became clear that plants and botany could be a really interesting way of better understanding the dynamics of urban nature in the city.
Fantastic. I mean, that relationship to London, does that have a relationship to the post-war leftover spaces in that city as well, or is that a bit of a tenuous connection there from me?
No, I mean, there are some very interesting parallels because after the war, there were these so-called bomb sites and empty spaces in both London and Berlin, and botanists in both cities really started to systematically investigate these unusual sites.
Sarah, you're an artist and one of your primary mediums is photography, which obviously has a long tradition of capturing these kinds of grand visions of the landscape, from Ansel Adams right through to Gursky. Your artworks, though, seem to be having a different kind of conversation with the landscape at a different scale and dynamic to that tradition. What is it that draws you to this idea of spontaneous landscapes present in the work of Matthew's film, and how do you see that interest playing out in your work?
Yeah, I guess with I was really interested in big grandiose landscapes and being able to go to Tasmania, but then the pandemic kind of hit, and I had to change my approach to making art and start focusing on what was in my local neighbourhood. So I started taking notice of living in the western suburbs and seeing a lot of these marginal spaces in industrial areas, and particularly Pipe Makers Park became an area of interest for me to document and to see what plant life actually existed in this mixture of a regenerative garden. And there just seemed to be a lot of biodiversity, different mix of native and non-native plants, and a lot of bird life that you would see in national parks, or because some of it was left to just overgrow and not be managed. So yeah, it was really interesting to start going to a place again and again and seeing what you can find. And the plants started to become the main actor, I suppose, and I wanted to juxtapose them with the landscapes and colour fields to kind of draw people's attention to, you know, the different shapes and forms that these plants have that we're meant to so-called dislike because they're weeds.
Yeah, it's really interesting to see in your work, and also in the film, actually, Matthew, there tends to be, and this is possibly broadly true of urban ecology as a practice, there's a shift in scale that happens where you become much more kind of focused on the detail, on the microcosm, as opposed to the macro scale as soon as you start thinking about these. It's a much more human way of thinking about the city in some ways. And it seems to be present in your photography and certainly in the recent activities you've done here at the Collingwood Yards. Matthew, to turn to the film again, one of the things that I find really compelling about it is that it's a botanical story, but also a story about people, and that the botanical story is completely enmeshed in the social and geopolitical forces of human history. So we have the invading armies that also happen to bring in adventive plant species. I was going to say invasive, but let's use adventive plant species along with them, and so on. One of the things you've spoken about in the past in relation to this is this idea of a cosmopolitan ecology. And I wonder if you could talk a little about what that idea is and how it plays out in the film.
Yes, I mean, I'm pleased you picked up on that word, adventive plants, which is used by the cultural historian Susanna Hauser in the film, and the way that this word is much less pejorative than the term invasive or exotic, for example, and is really about plants that simply arrive and then create this sense of ecological wonder and interest in terms of everyday spaces. But the notion of cosmopolitan ecologies is very interesting to me because historically there have been tensions in botany and also ecology more broadly around these questions of invasiveness, but also the notion of what a cultural landscape actually is. And one of the interesting things about the work that was done in Berlin is that these botanists effectively challenged narrowly nativist readings of cultural landscapes and actually made it very clear that all of these plants from all over the world were welcome within the city and formed part of this cosmopolitan urban ecology, which clearly has these political or ideological resonance in terms of a wider discourse in the city.
Yeah, I heard one of the interview subjects use that word contamination, which is obviously a very loaded word in the context of post-World War Berlin. Alistair, a lot of your research, writing and practice seems to have a relationship to this idea of cosmopolitan ecology. You've written about the need to acknowledge humans as vectors for plants and animals, and you've also written that we need to move away from the Haussmann model of monocultural avenue street planting. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the history of that Haussmann model and how you've seen it play out in the way we plan, design and manage our cities here in Australia.
Yeah, sure. So the Haussmann model is a reference to the redesign of Paris during the Napoleonic era, where they went from a kind of medieval city with little narrow laneways and streets to these big grand boulevards. with monocultural, evenly spaced plantings of trees, typically Platanus cross acifolia. And there's nothing essentially wrong with that, but I think the symbolism of that is problematic, because to me it kind of harks back to that 18th century French landscape tradition of the formal garden, and the ideology of the formal garden is to prove mankind's dominance over nature. So it's an abject rejection of wildness. And I think Matthew's film shows so beautifully how important wildness and letting vegetation being self-determinate in urban spaces is so critical for the human condition, in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, the Houseman, the impetus for that originally was also very literal control as well, wasn't it? Where you're basically worried about rioting in the streets, so you need to be able to bring in the cavalry. So to speak.
It was literally to allow armies to march into town to control. So it's like a landscape control, and it also dictates people's behaviours, what's allowable behaviour.
Yeah. Matthew, there's a really telling moment in the film where you ask one of your guests how best to translate the German word Brachen into English. You suggest wasteland, but your guest is really emphatic that that's the wrong word. By his reasoning, the closest term we might have to it in English might be sort of fallow lands or something like that, which is typically only applied in an agricultural context and generally means kind of to sort of waiting to be planted. We don't seem to have a word like that in English that connotes this idea of sort of unprogrammed but potent urban space. It's just wasteland. Do you think there might be a demand for Brachen-type urban spaces in the Anglosphere? Have you seen any cultural change here?
Yes, I mean, actually, that's one of my favourite moments in the film, because it's kind of funny to be directly contradicted in the middle of filming, but it turns out that it was a really welcome way of raising this question about different ideas about words. And I think one of the things that's very clear to me about urban nature is there is this very complex vocabulary and different ways of engaging with marginal spaces. So terrain vague is a word very familiar within architecture, but there are many other words we can draw on as well. I've been doing research in Chennai in southern India, and the word Peramboki is the term that is part of that cultural and political discourse. So this question of words and meanings is extremely interesting to me. And in terms of what to do with these marginal spaces, certainly in the German context, the word Brache has been, if you like, enlisted into quite sophisticated architectural and design discourses, so that now you have these new park designs in Berlin and elsewhere in Germany that specifically try to either protect or recreate a particular kind of Brachen aesthetic. And that's extremely interesting to me. That's something that previously was seen as a problem or something to be eradicated, has suddenly become much more interesting in cultural and ecological terms. So something is going on, particularly in Germany, to some extent in France. The UK, I would say, is lagging behind in terms of innovative approaches to marginal spaces of nature.
I was interested to see that not all of your subjects were entirely welcoming of that, what they call domestication of the Brachen, if you like. Sarah and Alistair, have you guys seen any kind of evidence of a cultural shift here in Australia towards more sort of sympathy for these kinds of Brachen-type spaces, leftover spaces, weedscapes, if you like, and so forth?
I think having conversations with people, asking people where do they go, especially when we were locked down, often a lot of people say, well, they did go to that golf course, or suddenly some spaces opened up that wouldn't have been explored. And also, I just think if more people have a conversation, maybe people become more interested in these places, because I think you have to be willing to go for a bit of a wander as well. And it's a little bit scary at first, but then it's like actually not. And yeah.
As a practicing landscape architect, my answer unfortunately is quite the opposite.
Oh, no. I thought this was going to be an upbeat moment for us to end on.
I think that when you're given a space to redesign, you no longer have any agency as a landscape architect on the plants you're going to choose for that site. If it's in the public realm, that's dictated to you by the local council. So I won't say what development because it's probably not appropriate, but it's in a post-industrial site within 10 kilometres of the CBD of Melbourne with contaminated soil, with heavy metal contamination. And the council said you will not get the permit unless it's 70% Indigenous, 20% Australian politically native, so they could be from Lord Howe Island or Christmas Island, and then 10% exotic. And the thing is that because this land is next to a riverway, the river's gone through the process of eutrophication, so it's much higher in nitrogen and phosphorus, which also in turn makes the soil much higher in that, and the seed bank has become entirely corrupted. So in order to try and reinstate Indigenous plants into that setting, it's going to require constant maintenance, usually in the form of millions of litres of glyphosate to try and achieve it. So it becomes a landscape artifice that is a socio-cultural landscape artifice, which becomes ecologically damaging.
And presumably makes it much harder to remediate the site as well. Obviously, you can't use those sort of transitional species that are a bit more hardy.
Yeah, and as we're going into rapid climate change in the urban realm, we need to be looking at performative species that can be hyperaccumulators of heavy metals, that can combat urban heat island effect, hold soil together through extreme rainfall events. I think the luxury of projecting a kind of social cultural idea of species selection is no longer relevant.
How do we change the minds of councils? That seems to be the biggest thing, where they keep mowing along, especially the Moonee Ponds Creek, don't allow things to just be. I mean, they'll have to change their regime somehow, or you work with councils, do you?
Well, yeah, I do work. I mean, I don't work for them, but I work with them. Yeah, I think it's a greater kind of sociocultural shift that needs to happen.
It's almost like that sort of nativist ideology, really, isn't it? But playing out in an urban design context, in a landscape context. This is probably a good opportunity to throw to the floor, actually, guys. If anybody has a question for Matthew or any of our panelists. The question there, Matthew, is: do you see a value in queer thinking frameworks or post-colonial frameworks for your research in this urban ecology space? Does it have any influence on your thinking?
Yes, thank you for the question. Yes, these fields of ideas certainly do have an influence over my work, which I elaborate in more detail in my book, Natura Urbana. I think both the fields of queer theory and also post-colonial theory, I think for me at least, they raise the question of complexity in a number of really interesting ways. And this, I think, forces us to think very carefully about different ways of classifying different forms of ecological and socio-ecological constellations in urban space. So it's about, for me, it's welcoming complexity, the unexpected, and also having a much more imaginative sense about the kinds of urban spaces and landscapes that we want. I picked up, I think I might have heard at a distance from the microphone, some comments about, if I got it right, trying to eradicate weeds and use of chemicals and so on. If I kind of picked up a little bit of that in the discussion. And just an interesting example, actually, where I live in East London, is that people have tried to use tree pits to grow flowers and herbs, or encourage brightly sort of interesting weeds and other plants, sort of nurture small spaces, if you like, in their own streets, which developed through the COVID lockdown period. But just a couple of weeks ago, local authorities used powerful weed killers and ripped up most of these plants in many streets, creating a kind of storm of protest. So I think it's quite difficult to establish these kind of viable lines of communication sometimes between streets and neighborhoods, and sometimes privatized authorities or utilities that manage street spaces as cheaply as they can under these very long contracts and so on. So it's a very complex field of negotiation and contestation, I think.
I I feel like there's parallels with Berlin and Melbourne, with how we used to have a lot of abandoned buildings and spaces sort of left to overgrow, but with rapid development, a lot of that is disappearing, and I feel like that's in the film as well. All these spaces in Berlin, you know, are not necessarily protected. And in Australia especially, I don't know if there's many people actually studying these sites like anywhere else like Berlin is. Have you seen examples of this happening other than Berlin, Matthew?
I think the point you raise is extremely interesting in terms of how vulnerable many of these interesting sites are to their removal and erasure. And in Berlin, there's a couple of exceptions which I try to highlight in the film. There's the Südgelände site that was turned into an urban nature reserve, very unusually, simply on the basis of its ecological interest. And then these other spaces that have been protected as part of very elaborate or sophisticated park design. But in terms of other cities, in France, the landscape designer Gilles Clément has been very interesting to me in terms of his attempt to bring in spontaneous ecologies within park design, sometimes leaving spaces within parks with different mowing regimes. And I think this is quite important in some of his designs, so that you can see there's an edge which indicates to people that it's not that people forgot to mow this particular area, but it's been allowed to develop spontaneously as part of the overall concept for the design. So I think there are important challenges, if you like, in terms of enriching public culture and bringing people into the conversation about what kind of urban ecologies we want and how we want cities to look.
It's a really fascinating development, actually, the development of sort of formal language that signifies to people this is a spontaneous landscape in a sense. I think I saw a question just popped up. The question relates to particularly in regards to this, I'm going to mispronounce this, Sudetenland park system. That park system was protected in a way due to the immense amount of study and research that the various urban ecologists were involved in, that was able to sort of demonstrate the ecological functionality of those spontaneous landscapes. Has that been important to the preservation of other spontaneous landscapes in Berlin? And indeed, might it be important? This could be a question for you, actually, Alistair, after we hear from Matthew. Might it be important to the preservation of these landscapes here in Australia? Matthew, I'll let you answer first there.
And just quickly to say that that quite sophisticated ecological discourses are quite widespread within discussions about a landscape design across the city in many different ways, and that beyond this specific nature reserve I mentioned, the recent design for Park am Gleisdreieck, which is a very, very successful public park just near to where I'm currently sitting, actually, that among the designers for this park were former students of the pioneer urban ecologists in the city. So there's a kind of generational effect in terms of education and knowledge in the city, and bringing these ideas about ecology directly into landscape and architectural discourse. So there are some very interesting and positive connections there that we can highlight.
Mm-hmm. Are you seeing that kind of knowledge disperse here in Australia, Alistair?
Yeah, I am, through the Academy, definitely. And I think there's a real opportunity with framing it as cosmopolitan ecology to start thinking about how we legislate that in Australia. So a perfect case study is that there was an amazingly healthy forest of Ulmus procera, English elm, which got nearly wiped out due to the Dutch elm disease in the 1970s in mainland Europe and the UK, but thrives here in Melbourne because we've got the Dutch elm leaf beetle, but not the disease. And this was a very, very healthy population, massive elm forest in Kew on the other side of the river from Abbotsford. And because that particular species has global significance for preservation, it should have been preserved, especially because it was growing in an urban environment. but instead it got cleared. Then they planted, indigenous tube stock, which got overrun with exotic, herbaceous weeds. And so it was a classic example of kind of cutting your nose off to spite your face. But I think that could be a way forward to get councils to think differently, as going, okay, we are part of a global community. And if these plants are critically endangered in their original habitat, but they're surviving here and they're not endangering one of their kind of intact ecosystems here, then they have worth of preservation. And then that giving that sense of worth, it's that idea of like canonizing something. The minute you can make the public see it has value, then they will fight to preserve it. At the moment in Australia, it's a very binary or polemic situation where it's native, even if it's a grevillea from Western Australia, which is a cultivar that's been made in a lab, has a moral value that's higher than a spontaneous plant. And that's what we're fighting against, is the kind of morals that have been pushed onto the plant species.
Yeah. And then maybe that's the role of words like adventive rather than invasive and so forth, to try and shift that cultural understanding.
Yeah, and Matthew was saying that, words are so powerful and so important, and it's true. Like in New South Wales, echiums are called Patterson's curse. In South Australia, they're called Salvation Jane, exactly the same plant.
And a weed in South Australia, or not considered a weed?
Well, they're a weed in both, but it's because in South Australia the sheep can eat it, whereas in New South Wales it poisons the cows.
That's a classic Australian botanical story right there. We've got time for one more question, guys, and then we probably have to wrap it up. There's an interest there, Matthew, in this idea of foraging and food security, and in particular some of the older traditions that are perhaps being lost with densification here in Australia and also in London, and it sounds like in Berlin as well, that are resulting in the loss of allotment gardens, that are resulting in the loss of backyard gardens. Is there a connection between those discourses around foraging and food security and your research and what you're seeing in these Brachen spaces in Berlin?
Right, I actually had a PhD student who did a project specifically on foraging in London, which was very, very interesting, because there is a connection with increased economic insecurity and people looking for food that's freely available, but it's also become a kind of a way of exploring the city, to go with groups of people and learn about different plants or sources of food. So the question of foraging is very present, but it also, I think, connects with the historical history of gleaning and the idea that food left over after the harvest should not be wasted. And is freely available to the community. There's a wonderful French film directed by Agnes Varda, The Gleaners and I. I don't know if anyone's seen that, but I think that the very idea of our connection with free sources of food in the city and other kinds of landscapes is such an interesting topic.
Fantastic. Well, we've managed to find a high note to end on eventually, so that's good. I think we could probably wrap it up there. Please join me in thanking Matthew and our speakers tonight.